Liberalism as a political ideology is based on liberty and equality before the law. Historically, those in favor of liberalism had exceptions on who could receive this liberty and equality, just not as many exceptions as those to their political right. One integral component to liberalism is capitalism, an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned. Classical liberal philosophers stated that since liberalism is all about freedom, then the market must be free as well, even if that market makes others less free. This seems to be a contradiction because of the social ills that capitalism causes, like economic disparity, poverty, and, I don't know, the literal destruction of our environment that will cause our planet to be either inhospitable or even uninhabitable by human beings. And it is a contradiction of sorts, but the contradiction fluctuates here and there over the course of history. If liberalism were a numbered list of what it is, capitalism would not always be the number one priority among all liberals. But capitalism is prioritized under the predominant form of liberalism in the modern day, neoliberalism. And if you stick with me throughout the video, I will be happy to explain this further through the time-honored tradition of using a well-known, mainstream example to make this easier to understand and a heck of a lot more palatable than reading the works of David Harvey and other critics of neoliberalism. I am referring, of course, to Saturday Night Live. Before we get to SNL, we have to understand some basic definitions. You can't build a house without a foundation. I promise this part will only take a few minutes. In the United States, liberalism has a noticeably different meaning than in much of the developed world. In the US, a liberal is anyone who is to the left of conservatives, and since conservatives in the US are particularly far-right compared to much of the developed world, a liberal is actually closer to a centrist in terms of social issues and center-right in terms of economic issues, at least by the standards of other developed nations. A US liberal politician or voter may consider themselves on the opposite end of the political spectrum than a conservative, but a more objective placement of liberals in the US by global standards is somewhere in the center, and perhaps even to the right. In Canada, the Liberal Party is well known as the centrist party, with the Conservative Party to its political right and the New Democratic Party to its political left. In the United Kingdom, the Liberal Democrats are the centrist party, and the Conservative Party to its right, and Labour to its left. In much of the world, liberalism is understood as centrist, which means in the US, the only two parties that hold any real power are either conservative, the Republican Party, or centrist, the Democratic Party. Liberalism and conservatism are ideologies. An ideology is a system of ideas that form the basis of a political belief or policy. All ideologies state facts, but then use those facts to come to different conclusions and to perform different actions. Example: Black Americans outnumber white Americans among the prison population. A left-wing examination of this fact would note that Black Americans are far more likely to be convicted of the exact same crime as a white American. Also, that generational wealth and other factors have unfairly led to Black Americans being more impoverished than white Americans, which can sometimes lead to crime. Also, Black Americans are policed more heavily than white Americans, racism is a factor in policing, and that the prison pipeline is the product of privatization of prisons. These factors would lead to the conclusion that systemic racism has a hand in this discrepancy in prison populations, capitalism has a hand in the exploding prison population in general, and that steps should be taken to drastically change the criminal justice system. Conversely, a fascist would look at the prison population and have that fact reinforce their belief in white supremacy and the genetic inferiority of some people. Same fact, different conclusions based on their ideologies. Liberalism as an ideology is opposed to the left because the left opposes capitalism, or is skeptical of capitalism's benefits. The left does not contain liberals, it contains socialists and other leftists. Whether socialists want to count democratic socialists and social democrats among their numbers is another topic altogether, but suffice it to say, the left rejects what liberalism has predominantly become: neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has a variety of definitions, and people argue over what exactly it means, but the best and simplest definition is that it is the ideology that capitalism is an overall good and that social progress, historically a liberal ideal, is best achieved through capitalism. In fact, neoliberalism as an ideology prioritizes capitalism. Neoliberalism does not take far-right positions like arch-conservatives and fascists, but it still prioritizes capitalism over the public good. It frames capitalism as serving the public good through itself in a kind of circular logic. A politician does not even have to be a liberal in order to further the ideology of neoliberalism. See Ronald Reagan. Naturally, capitalism inequitably benefits very few people over the vast majority of the world, but neoliberalism posits that the good of the corporation is to the benefit of all, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Previous versions of liberalism imagined society to be divided into distinct public and private spheres. The public sphere was under the rule of the state, and its role, at least on paper, was to ensure the legal rights and freedoms of citizens through rule of law. Politics took shape around the line between public and private, a kind of struggle over where to draw the line. Within liberalism, politics was a question of how to define and use the limits of the state within capitalism. Neoliberalism erases the line between public and private, to create a society based on private market competition. Neoliberalism adjusts the horizons of the struggle between the public and the private. The state does not go away, but is instead reconstructed toward the new end of expanding private markets. Under neoliberalism, social progress occurs, but only incrementally because it can only be allowed if it's profitable. There is a reason why every U.S. corporation has begun to take advantage of Pride Month. A corporation is not a person, no matter what the Supreme Court says, so a corporation did not have a come-to-Jesus moment as it relates to treating the LGBT community with respect. Rather, the people within the corporation crunched the numbers and concluded that courting the LGBT community is now more profitable than not courting the LGBT community. Bear in mind, that's not to say that Oreo tweeting support for gay people is somehow a bad thing. It's promising and telling about our society that this is no longer corporate suicide. However, it is an example of how our sluggish incremental social progress happens under neoliberalism and how social progress can only be achieved when economically convenient. This also means that if the status quo is economically convenient, then it must be maintained. That means capitalism must maintain itself. Under neoliberalism, privatization of public works and deregulation are both permissible if they are profitable. Now, in fairness, some neoliberal politicians are in favor of more safety regulations and less privatization than the far right, but that is only incrementally better than the worse alternative, rather than an actual public good. Also, while it is undoubtedly better that important safety regulations exist than not exist, these regulations also exist to reinforce the idea of capitalism among the populace as a public good, to draw contrast between themselves as the erroneous, good capitalists, and divert attention from the ills of capitalism as a system. Now, Saturday Night Live. Remember Saturday Night Live? This is an essay about Saturday Night Live. SNL is a late-night variety show with comedy sketches and musical acts. It was created by Lorne Michaels, who was the primary showrunner from 1975 to 1980. He returned around 1985 and has been its showrunner and executive producer ever since. It airs on NBC, and its production company is Broadway Video, owned by Michaels himself. If you listen to Donald Trump, you might mistake SNL for a far-left television series with performers taking revolutionary or even at least a firm stance against the status quo. But the truth is, Broadway Video is a business. And much like neoliberalism as an ideology, SNL is only as progressive or left-leaning as a business will allow. Not very. SNL pays lip service to progressive causes while maintaining enough of the status quo to not alienate conservatives, either as voters or viewers. This means that SNL will never directly challenge capitalism and will often mine humor from conservative or even reactionary talking points if it suits the show. The primary consideration under neoliberalism is capitalism, and the primary consideration under capitalism is competition against other competing entities for a greater share of the market, with the end goal of monopoly. Thus, the primary consideration for SNL is whether or not this show, idea, host, or opinion will draw ratings and earn more advertising money. Liberals might argue that this means SNL has no ideology, but the phrase, "I'm apolitical," is itself a political stance, and usually a rather telling one. Neoliberalism has become such a default that it has become ideologically invisible. Much in the same way that I know how to drive a car but don't know the names for all the parts or how to fix it, one can perform under neoliberalism without even knowing the definition of the word, or the larger systems in which we are all participating. Neoliberalism pushes back against social progress that is deemed unprofitable, not yet profitable, or too radical, and pushes back against economic progress that grants greater power to the people and less power to corporations. Let's look at some of the ways that SNL does these two things. The ways that SNL reinforces a neoliberal ideology among its audience. In 2015, Larry David guest starred and played Bernie Sanders, and the takeaway from the sketch was this.
The one on the far left. So far left it could never be elected.
Neoliberal media doesn't hold up a big banner and say, "We love capitalism," but instead engages with topics related to capitalism uncritically. In 2018, Steve Carell guest hosted and played Amazon founder Jeff Bezos in a sketch meant to lift up Bezos and poke fun at Donald Trump. Prior to the sketch, Bezos dominated the headlines after Amazon announced it would open up headquarters in Queens, New York, and Crystal City, Virginia. New Yorkers protested the move, as a similar Amazon HQ in Seattle helped drive up rent prices for locals and exacerbate income inequality. Another concern was that all of the money that the city was giving to Amazon amounted to corporate welfare and could be better used for public services and people in need. Not to mention the fact that Amazon is owned by the wealthiest businessman in the world and does not require this corporate welfare to continue his business, and the fact that Amazon is a viciously anti-union corporation that has been consistently criticized for the way it treats its workers. The SNL sketch completely ignored this, glossed over New Yorkers' concerns, and focused on presenting the image of the good capitalist over Trump, the bad capitalist. When the deal between New York and Amazon fell through, Colin Jost remarked that regardless of what anyone thought of Amazon, this deal would have created jobs. Yes, but investing the money into new jobs instead of just Bezos' pockets would do that too, Colin. SNL will, far more often than not, reinforce the status quo of capitalism and the profit motive. SNL is no stranger to reactionary social positions as well, like when Colin Jost blamed the Trump victory on there being more than two genders. No, Colin. Trump won because of voter suppression, a less than exciting opponent, a massive media push to shine a spotlight on Trump, including your own show, Colin, and an electoral system that can allow someone to still lose to a less popular candidate. It is not the fault of people who are now just beginning to be treated like human beings. I get that it's a joke, but it's also transphobic, Colin. This is actually something that SNL does all the time. It reinforces a neoliberal status quo, not a left-wing or even a progressive position. There are frequent examples of dismissing identity politics and intersectionality. Here are some examples.
Man, wow. You have a lot to learn about identity politics.
I know they're white because I'm white, and it is my greatest shame, so...
Chances are I'm going to end up in jail in my 70s anyway for saying something that's fine now but will be punishable by death in 40 years.
SNL makes Trump and Vladimir Putin out to be secret lovers. The false idea that all or most homophobes are gay lays the blame of homophobia on LGBT people. It is blaming a group of people for their own subjugation. Under this false idea, the only people discriminating against the gays are the gays. It shifts blame to the victims of homophobia and discrimination rather than the perpetrators of homophobia and discrimination. These are only a few examples from the most recent season. This has been going on for decades. But SNL has done something far worse and an even clearer example of neoliberalism. Profit as priority over all else. On November 7th, 2015, roughly a year before Election Day, Donald Trump hosted Saturday Night Live. The decision to allow Trump to host was met with incredible criticism from the left and from garden variety liberals. This was following Trump's fear-mongering remarks about Mexicans coming into the country to rape and murder us, but before his fear-mongering remarks about calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. It is not unusual for politicians to appear on SNL. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Rudy Giuliani, Sarah Palin, and countless others have appeared for cameos and one-off sketches. However, it is unusual for politicians to host the show, to be the actual host. John McCain has done it twice in 2002 and 2008. Jesse Jackson did it once in 1984 during his presidential campaign, and that's about it. There are over 800 episodes of SNL, and those few are about the only examples. Trump hosted SNL before during the run of The Apprentice, but this was long before his campaign. SNL undoubtedly believed that the controversy would draw ratings, and they were correct in that assumption. Neoliberalism prioritizes earnings and maintaining capitalism above all other concerns. That means that genuine concerns about Trump's appearance, further legitimizing a racist demagogue to the American public, and concerns about helping a campaign that would make this man leader of the free world, went ignored in favor of a short-term ratings boost. The Trump host episode in 2015 was easily one of the worst that SNL ever presented. Trump could not act, which meant that nearly all of the sketches had to navigate their way around this by having him almost always face directly into the camera so he could surreptitiously read the cue cards. Worse than that, the sketches that featured Trump could only be mildly critical of him. Trump famously eschews any real criticism. His Comedy Central roast years prior was apparently kneecapped by orders to stay away from certain sensitive subjects. Without a doubt, some writers and performers were uncomfortable with both the decision to allow him to host and the decision to make light of his failings rather than sincerely criticize him. But as in all cases, the workers and management are defined by unbalanced power dynamics. Kate McKinnon is not as powerful as Lorne Michaels. Let's go through all of the segments that featured Trump. The monologue started off with Trump congratulating himself on his wealth and, for some reason, his looks, then transitioned into mocking Rosie O'Donnell and doubling down on his statements about her appearance. Then we had a series of unfunny Trump impersonations interrupted by SNL completely dismissing criticism against their own show. Larry David played a malcontent in the audience, completely taking the wind out of the protest by mocking it. Next was a sketch about Trump as president, a dark portent of things to come that made light of the criticism against Trump's outrageous and dog-whistle racist claims of making America great again. They made a joke about the ludicrous idea of Omarosa becoming part of the Trump administration a couple years prior to Trump actually doing that. Ivanka Trump, the real one, made an appearance and received no applause whatsoever for her unannounced guest spot. Again, the joke is supposed to be that Trump has his daughter have influence in his administration, and then 2 years later he literally did that. This sketch is even worse in retrospect. Ivanka said her lines, and the room grew 10 degrees colder. Hey, you know how Trump is a terrible racist whose very words would eventually incite violence against Hispanic immigrants? Well, that's just another border wall joke for SNL. Isn't it funny? The next sketch is the various SNL cast members learning about Trump's mean tweets about them, the same platform that has seen Donald Trump radicalize his followers. Then they made light of Trump's birtherism, a racist campaign against the United States' first African-American president. None of this is actually mocking Trump. It's a roast, poking gentle fun for the purpose of praising someone rather than sincerely deriding them. The rest was part embarrassing and part vile. The episode did a lot to humanize Trump to the American public. All his worst features, his racism, his sexism, his insensitivity, his bad policies, the gravity of what he wanted to say and do to the country was taken out. Criticism against him was deflated. Once it's a joke, it's not serious anymore. That's not to say that SNL was solely responsible for getting Donald Trump elected. That would be ridiculous. But his guest host spot was symptomatic of neoliberal media that saw Trump not as a genuine threat, but as a ratings winner. Donald Trump was given significantly more media coverage than any of his Republican opponents in the primary. By some estimates, he was given $2 billion worth of free advertising by the news media. Trump was ratings, and that was all that mattered. Every rally, every speech, every slip-up, every tweet was given an unbalanced amount of attention by the media. Donald Trump was a celebrity, one who said inflammatory things that, in a better world, would have made the media dismiss him and focus on more serious candidates. But we don't live in a better world. We live in a neoliberal world. We live in a world in which it's okay for SNL to give this man an hour and a half to promote his campaign for president. We live in a world in which Jimmy Fallon can have a completely friendly, charitable interview with a racist demagogue because it meant ratings. We live in a world where the media will spotlight anyone who might cause a stir and create ratings. Donald Trump did not get elected because of pronouns, Colin. He got elected because it was profitable to give him that much attention and to treat him like a serious politician. He got elected because of neoliberalism. One charge against SNL by the Republican Party and Donald Trump specifically is that the late-night program has a radical left-wing agenda for consistently mocking Trump himself, even after he helped them pull in strong ratings for his guest host spot. The unceasing mockery and open opposition by the cast toward Donald Trump might seem unusual to some, but this does not a leftist agenda make. Mockery of Donald Trump on SNL is not the result of far-left politics, but of neoliberalism, as was mockery of previous presidents. The mockery is performed across both parties because of the economic incentive to do so. The President of the United States is always the most famous figure in the country. Lampooning famous figures draws in viewers more than lampooning barely known figures due to recognition and familiarity. Remember, the primary consideration for SNL is whether or not this will draw ratings and earn more advertising money, not whether or not it will help someone get elected or removed from office. In the late 80s and early 90s, Dana Carvey performed an exaggerated impersonation of then-President George H.W. Bush. His hand gestures and clownish facial expressions did not actually resemble Bush, but this caricature of Bush became what many thought of when they thought of Bush. This sketch is about the early days of the Gulf War, and while there is a whiff of anti-imperialism in the sketch when Carvey references the failure of Vietnam, it's never explored. Carvey quickly pivots to his Bush catchphrase, "wouldn't be prudent," and then goes on a comical tirade about receiving Christmas gifts from other countries to help support the war. The real George H.W. Bush ran a racist campaign to become president, committed horrific war crimes, refused to cooperate with the Iran-Contra Special Counsel, continued Reagan's policy of allowing AIDS to go on unchecked, and ramped up the racist war on drugs. SNL's portrayal of Bush Sr., however, made him a lovably goofy figure. His portrayal was endearing, so much so that the subject of the mockery made an appearance on SNL that received wide acclaim. It's not in the financial interest of SNL to bring up Bush's war crimes. Bill Clinton was portrayed by Phil Hartman and later Darrell Hammond throughout the Clinton administration. The real Bill Clinton helped bring about mass incarceration of people of color in America. SNL's portrayal of Clinton was that of a horny doofus. The primary consideration was not to get Clinton impeached. It was to make money off of Clinton's embarrassing scandal, but not rock the boat too hard in such a way that would alienate viewers. Left-wing concerns about Clinton's neoliberalism and racist endorsement of the 1994 federal crime bill were ignored and instead replaced with only playful mockery of Clinton as merely an amorous troublemaker that men could relate to. SNL goes to great lengths to avoid any meaningful satire. The impersonation of Barack Obama is not remembered as fondly or even as well because there isn't much that's inherently funny about him. However, Obama's portrayal on SNL does highlight the difference between the political right's criticism of this president and the left's criticism. The right's criticism of Obama was full of lies. That he was foreign-born or that Obamacare would install death panels in place of doctors. The right's cheap shots were usually about inconsequential things like Grey Poupon and the color of his suits. Criticism of Obama from the right was laughable, and that became the only funny thing about Obama for SNL. Criticism from the left, that Obama further escalated the war on terror, which has resulted in untold civilian casualties, was ignored. Obama's bog-standard neoliberalism was ignored because it would mean SNL turning the mirror against itself. SNL has always poked fun at politicians, and while the mockery of Donald Trump is both more frequent and pointed, this has less to do with an emboldened radical leftist agenda by Lorne Michaels of all people, and more to do with the fact that there is significantly more material for the neoliberal SNL machine with which to craft and perform said mockery. Ratings for SNL have increased during the Trump administration in no small part due to the comical portrayal of Trump, which means those with financial interests in SNL have no objections to a Trump presidency. The George H.W. Bush impersonation by Dana Carvey had to reach cartoonish exaggeration in order to make fun of a plain-spoken, unenthusiastic president who was more immune to gaffes, whereas the impersonation of Trump requires little, if any, embellishment. Many Trump sketches are mere verbatim recitations of the Donald's own words in new context. None of these impersonations do much, if anything, to hurt the president. If anything, they humanize the president, or turn him into such a cartoon character that he no longer seems threatening. Pop culture portrayals of sitting presidents and other politicians have an effect on how the public at large sees the figure. Take Sarah Palin, for instance, a politician whose career will forever be connected to her impersonation by Tina Fey on SNL. Fey later recognized that this humanized Palin, softened her image, and made her arch-conservative politics less threatening instead of more threatening. Fey even addressed this in an episode of 30 Rock, in which Tracy Morgan's character somehow makes the Republican more electable. SNL's inclusion of Donald Trump as a frequently recurring character may do more to both humanize and normalize the president, portraying him as just another in a long line of presidential impersonations, thereby legitimizing him to the audience. Admittedly, the options here are few. They could choose not to address the elephant in the room for 4 to 8 years, but that could have its own problems. The third option could be to openly portray Trump as a monster and not as comic relief. The sketches could still be funny, but the humor could be darker and more pointed. This has probably never even been considered. Like I said, SNL goes to great lengths to avoid anything resembling meaningful satire. The idea that Alec Baldwin's now famous impersonation of Donald Trump hurts the Trump presidency is not backed up by the history of how SNL's impersonations generally soften the image of politicians, or how the history of SNL chooses its targets, whoever happens to be in the White House. Trump as a recurring character on SNL is okayed by Lorne Michaels for the same reason he wanted Trump as the guest host, because the primary consideration centers around capitalism. Any other consequences are secondary or even ignored. Once again, based on some of the sketches, many of the SNL writers and cast probably legitimately dislike Trump, but that doesn't make SNL a left-wing show. It just means the SNL writers represent most of America based on all available polling. Trump is objectively unpopular. SNL isn't going hard on Trump because Lorne Michaels thinks it's in the nation's best interest. Lorne Michaels donates to the Republican Party and has previously stated that Republicans can take a joke better than Democrats. Trump and SNL benefit from one another. SNL benefited from the ratings of the Trump episode and the increased ratings during its Trump impersonation era. Trump benefited from how SNL normalized and legitimized him during his host episode, and because it now allows Trump a talking point every Saturday night or Sunday morning, that he is under attack by the liberal media and Hollywood, two common refrains that galvanize his base and make them want to protect him. SNL makes self-satisfied liberals laugh harmlessly at Trump and makes conservatives want to defend dear leader even more. Lorne Michaels might even hope that Trump gets re-elected, as it would allow his highly rated Trump sketches to continue. Baldwin claims that he's done playing Trump. We'll see about that. But even if someone else takes on the role, SNL and Trump will both still benefit from the mockery on the late-night show. It's a symbiotic relationship. Now, having heard everything that's been said in this video, some might respond by saying, well, of course the state and corporations put profits before everything else. You're not telling me anything I don't already know. Okay, but remember when I said that different ideologies use the same facts to come to separate conclusions and solutions? Both the state and corporations work together under the philosophy of neoliberalism to put the profit motive before every other consideration, regardless of the consequences. Those are the facts about what neoliberalism is. So, do you think it should be that way, or do you think it should not be that way? The point is not that it's happening. The point is, shouldn't we oppose it? And how? I certainly don't have all the answers. Neoliberalism is a global hegemony, a dominant idea and system, and it's going to take a lot to fix the world. We can start by at least recognizing it when it's right in front of us, by supporting movements, direct action, and even politicians who are skeptical of neoliberalism. by engaging with this ideology critically instead of uncritically, and by dismissing this hegemony as natural when it is most certainly unnatural, and allowing ourselves to believe in the potential for a better world.
'Cause when I look up from the pavement, I know I'm gonna be just fine. And I put on my dancing shoes real tight, 'cause it's just another Saturday